This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Once again, Jesus is teaching in the temple. Now, last Sunday, we shifted gears. We'd been in John chapter 7, and it was the tabernacle, the Feast of Tabernacles, and then we shifted gears when we got into chapter 8. Now, there's another shift, and Jesus is now back in the temple, and he's teaching. And so, this time he's at an area that's called the treasury, and I want you to see this on a little diagram that's up here, so you'll kind of understand and get a picture of it. Are we stuck? Well, okay, right there is where he is. And there we go. No? There we go. Okay. This is an artist's rendering of the temple, and this area here, out here, this is called the Court of the Gentiles, because the Gentiles were allowed to come there, but they were not allowed to go in. They would normally have gone in through the eastern gate, which is right there. This wall back here, that's the western wall. You hear about people going to the western wall and all? That's where that is. That's the back side of it. But they would come in the eastern gate, and they would go into this courtyard here. This courtyard here was a little bit more exclusive. That's where a lot of the sacrifices and stuff went on there. And then this big building here, that's where one person, the high priest, would go in there to the Holy of Holies. And so, but out in this area here, this large courtyard here, this was known as the Court of Women. And the reason it was known as the Court of Women was because women and children were not allowed to go, and most men were not allowed to go through that doorway right there. So they would stay, most of the people would stay in this area. It wasn't derogatory toward the women, it was just somehow or other, it just became known as the Court of Women. It wasn't something that God said, you will call this Court of Women. It wasn't that sort of thing. They just referred to it that way. In this courtyard here, where most of the people, men and women, would go, very few were allowed to actually go in. I'm talking about relatively speaking. Very few would actually go into this area, and of course only one went in here. Most of them hung out here whenever they would go to the temple. And so when they were here, this area here, there was a lot of teaching that would go on here. The rabbis would be there, and they would teach, and there would be little groups that would meet, and a lot of them would meet in this little area here that you can see the roof line there. This area here, underneath there, that area was called the treasury, because in that area was where they would put the containers where people would leave their tithes and offerings. They actually called them trumpets, because they looked like trumpets. They were kind of open at the top, and then they kind of narrowed down. And there were several of those in this portico, behind those columns and all. But in that area, back in those areas there, is where groups would meet and rabbis would teach, and this is where Jesus is. He's in this area as we're studying now. And if you'll notice, you'll see these contraptions here. These are menorahs, big giant menorahs. Those are big. They use those to light the courtyard, and they would have, sometimes they would burn all the time. And these lights would burn, and they were very bright at night, but they would burn, and it was in that context that Jesus is teaching, and I would assume, we can probably draw, that it was probably from these menorahs that Jesus drew his illustration, and he said in John chapter 8, verse 12, which is our passage today, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Now I want you to picture this what's happening here. Jesus is teaching. He's considered a teacher, a rabbi. And he's teaching in the temple area. The backdrop there of the menorahs, I don't know if it was during the day, it could have been toward the evening, and the light was real obvious. But in that context, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And what he was teaching them was something very, very critical, very specific, that he wanted them to get. He wanted them to focus on. I want us to discover what it was that Jesus was saying and how we can apply that in our lives. And there were basically 4 things that we can draw from this passage of Scripture. The first one is that Jesus was saying he is the illumination for those people in darkness. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. What he was saying was, I am the illumination. I am the light of the world is the second of several I ams that are recorded in the Gospel of John. Some people have for years wrote that there were 7 great I ams in the Gospel of John. There's actually more than 7. I think there's actually 9. But the 7 I ams that they were referred to his nature and his character and his divinity. And so the first one that he said was, I am the bread of life. Remember, we studied that? Now he's saying, I am the light of the world. And in declaring himself as the light of the world, he was claiming that he is the exclusive source of spiritual light. Now that was an amazing statement for him to say. Remember, he's a rabbi. He's teaching there in the temple. There are other rabbis, probably some other rabbis teaching at the same time over in other little groups, whatever it was. And so for this Jesus, this rabbi, to say, I am the light of the world, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life, that was very, very powerful and very intimidating at the same time. What he was saying was there is no other source of spiritual truth that is available to mankind. There is no other source of true spiritual insight than Jesus himself. Now, I want to say something here because I know that we record this and we put this out here for the world, and it goes on the internet. There are a lot of religions who teach that Jesus was just a good prophet, or that he was a good teacher, that he was just a good man. But if Jesus was just a good teacher and just a good prophet, then he would not have said that. Because a good teacher and a good prophet is going to teach the truth. And what Jesus was saying, not only here, but we see it several times in John, was he was saying he was God. And so he was either God or he wasn't. And if he was a good prophet and a good teacher, if that's all he was, then he wasn't God. But he said he was God. He also said he was the light of life in this very passage. Now, was he or wasn't he? So, for those people who believe that Jesus was just a prophet, a good prophet, or a good teacher, you're limiting what Jesus said about himself. He is who he says he is, or he's a liar and a lunatic. So is he Lord? Is he King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Is he God as he portrayed himself? Or was he just a liar and a lunatic that was deceiving people and leading them astray? Which was he? And so when we look at this passage today, we're looking at it from the standpoint of something that just astounded these people. For him to make this sort of statement and to come before them in the context of sitting there at the temple and teaching with the menorahs burning and to say that I am the light of life was remarkable. It was just an amazing statement for them to hear. They'd never heard anything like that before. But remember back in the earlier part of the gospel when we were in chapter 1, John chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. This is what the gospel says about Jesus. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now that was said about Jesus. He was the revelation of this thing called light that obviously represents something. The word light means something. We need to understand what it is. We'll take a look at it here in just a few moments. But what was this all about? For John to say this about Jesus was a pretty remarkable statement. And for Jesus to say, I am the light of life, that's a pretty remarkable thing. John also said later in 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, he said, this is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. What he was saying was, Jesus is the true revelation of spiritual truth, period. There is no darkness in him. There's no deception in him whatsoever. There are no shadows. There's no gray area. There's no like, well, maybe sort of like if something. Nope. He is either who he says he is or he's not. And if he is God, and he says he's God, then we need to be listening to what he says. And if he's not, then we need to ignore everything he said. But this nonsense about, well, he was just a good teacher or he was just a good prophet doesn't fly. Because he either was or he wasn't. He was either God or he wasn't. There's no in between. So Jesus says about himself that he is the illumination for those who are in darkness. The second thing that he says in this passage is that it is God who brings light into your darkness. Now look at the way I've worded that phrase. It is God who brings light into your darkness. Now this is important to pick up on, because God doesn't tell you to come out of the darkness and follow him. That's not what he's saying at all. You don't find that in the scriptures at all. What he does is he goes into your darkness and illuminates your life, and then he leads you out of the darkness. We have this idea sometimes that it is our job to get ourselves or pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and make ourselves better for God. And so it's like, okay, I realize I'm in some darkness and I've got to find my way out of the darkness and then I can start serving God. But that's not what he says. That's not what he teaches. It is God who brings light into your darkness. Just as when God spoke light into existence, and when he did that, he put destiny in motion, when he brings light into your darkness, he puts your destiny in motion. Just as at the very beginning of time in Genesis chapter 1, the very first thing that Jesus did. I mean, when you look at Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning was, is the revelation of God. And what was the first thing he did? He revealed light, and he separated light from darkness, and the light he called day, and the darkness he called night. That's the very first thing he did, was he revealed light. And he came and did that. And by creating light, he separated the darkness from the light. Now he does the same thing in your life. He comes into your life and brings light. Now, does that mean that all of a sudden everything is clear and crystal clear and you understand everything? No. But it does mean that you now have some illumination where you can see things differently. And because you can see, he leads you out of your darkness.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.